Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some studies that I've run recently where I've explored the use of artificial intelligence to check for adherence to reporting guidelines. I've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to skip through a few things, but please feel free to ask questions at the end of anything you need clarity for. Okay, I probably don't need to tell this audience, but poor reporting of clinical evidence is a problem. It's a problem because it's wasteful and it can lead to downstream negative impacts on care, and it reduces the reliability and the trustworthiness of research. And it's an important topic which many people have tried to tackle. One of the most common, perhaps the most well-known ways that people have tried to improve the standards of clinical evidence reporting is through the introduction of reporting guidelines. Many reporting guidelines have now been introduced. Probably the most familiar are the consolidated standards of reporting trials and the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. I've actually had to type those out because they're more commonly known as consort and PRISM guidelines. When those guidelines have been introduced, for example, when they've been stipulated by journals, so people submit a paper, the paper has to be formatted and include the details the guidelines suggest. It's improved the standard of reporting, although I think everybody involved in the area could agree we probably do need more evidence about that. Unfortunately, even in places or even in systems where reporting guidelines have been introduced, sometimes adherence can be poor. And so there's been recently many different efforts to develop interventions that can improve adherence. A very good review, a scoping review from 2019 from Blanco and colleagues, outlined many of the interventions up until that point and categorized in different categories. And one of them which they identified is the use of tools to allow someone to, a reviewer or an author, to check whether a paper adheres to a certain set of reporting guidelines and provide feedback. And that's the one that's most relevant to our talk today. Unless you've been somewhere very remote, you will know that there is considerable interest at the moment in using artificial intelligence to help with certain aspects of peer review. There are some tools that are already available, in fact, are embedded in many workflows, such as plagiarism checkers or statistics checkers like StatReview, which I think is now part of Editorial Manager. These machine learning and AI approaches to help with aspects of peer review and reporting standards. A bit less has been done on using these tools to check and help improve adherence to reporting guidelines. It's a study by Wang from last year, which used natural language processing techniques to create a useful tool, a bit like the plagiarism tools, which could check a paper. But the work I'm going to present today was inspired by a paper that came out last year from Liu and Shah, which looked at the ability of the GPT family of AI models to perform various peer review tasks. And in there, they examined the ability of GPT-4 to check papers for adherence to checklist, reporting guideline checklists, and found that it had about, compared to humans, so the human label, was it compliant or not, it had about 86% accuracy, which is really good. And actually, one of the authors of that paper, Nihar Shah, presented those results amongst many others in this forum in May in a really interesting talk. And so I encourage you to go back and look at that. I'm just a quick slide about terminology here. I'm going to use the term AI and large language models interchangeably through this talk. Probably I shouldn't do. Large language models are what I've used in my studies. They are researching LLMs as a subset of the overall artificial intelligence research ecosystem. So when I say AI, what I do mean is the large language foundation models. And these models are extremely large. They have very many billions of parameters, more than that sometimes in the newer ones. And they're also pre-trained on very, very, very large amounts of data, text. And they're foundation models so that the argument and the reason people are so interested is they can be tuned to many different uses. They've shown promising abilities to decipher, generate, and quote unquote understand language. And many people will be familiar with these models because the most common or the most well-known is the generative pre-trained GPT family of models from OpenAI. And that's certainly the family of models that's been most often investigated for their ability to perform certain peer-reviewed tasks. Okay, so the overall research question I was interested in asking is, can large language models, AI, be used to check adherence to clinical trial reporting guidelines? I'm going to present the results from a series of exploratory studies in a sample of sports medicine clinical trials where I attempted to at least partially answer that question. Why sports medicine? Two reasons. One is I have a background in kinesiology. That was my first degree. Our research group has extensive knowledge of sports medicine publishing and editorial decisions. But I think sports medicine is an interesting field to test a system like this or models like this because it has a reporting problem. For pretty much every year since about 2000, there's been a new systematic review or new analysis that's shown poor reporting practices in the field. Not everyone in the field, just there are some journals or some particular subsets. Really interesting paper and a really important one for my studies was from 2022 by Schultz and colleagues. And they reported that in a sample of sports medicine papers published in that year, that less than a third actually justified their sample size, less than half actually defined what their primary outcome was, and less than 20% actually gave enough details of their randomization. So I consider sports medicine papers of sports medicine to say a good severe test of the ability of artificial intelligence to check for adherence to reporting guidelines. For our studies, we used the data set that was provided by Schultz and colleagues for two reasons. One, it's an excellent paper, and I'm confident that the results are robust. But two is that the data set is open, so that they have made open on the Open Science Framework their labels that they apply to each paper, the answer they gave to each reporting guideline question. There are many papers that have looked at consort adherence in particular, or reporting guideline adherence in general in a particular subfield, but very few of those make their data open, which is definitely going to be a problem for meta-research area in the future. 160 papers were identified in that article. In my data set, there are only 113 of those papers. Those represented the papers at the time I could get clean and usable machine readable text from. I used the results that Schultz had all made open as the ground truth labels, so the labels against which I compared the performance of the AI system. And I looked at 9 reporting guidelines. There are more in the Schultz paper. These are the ones that I could confidently match and confidently answer myself when looking through the labels to confirm tests. They're from the introduction method results. Very quickly, I'll touch on the method that we used. The data set was split into a training and testing data set, 80-20 split, and each one was stratified by the paper section, so the same percentage of questions about the method and the introduction results were in both data sets. Each paper, I extracted the text from the introduction, method, and results, and then put that text into an API call to the large language model. So what that involved was giving the large language module a system prompt, which is a set of instructions that help it frame its answer, attaching the specific question, so for the introduction question, sending that to the large language model via their API, and then asking the large language model to perform 2 tasks. One was to summarize the relevant text from the introduction, for example, that was relevant to the question, and then give a one-word answer, yes or no. Was the did the text, and answered the question. An example of that process is in the table at the bottom of the slide there, where you move from the text to the system prompt question, then the answer the large language model gives. For the first study, the results of this study are pre-printed already on medRxiv. I examined the model I used, the large language model I used was GPT 3.5, which is an older model and an older model than you would expect to see, for example, in the chat GPT application, if you're familiar with that. We went through the method of all the papers and the tuning that I performed with the training data set. So when with the results of the training data set, I would tune aspects of the API call. Specifically in this case, the hyperparameters of the large language model, and I tried to tune the hyperparameters that are to do with how random and diverse its answers will be. And I also used the data set to fine-tune aspects of the large language model's weights, so the weights in the neural network. And then once that was an iterative process 2 or 3 times, and then I tested the model on the test data set. In this pilot study, that gave us reasonable accuracy, 86% accuracy, which, if you remember, was pretty much the same result as Liu and Shah found from their paper. Oh, there's a bit of feedback there. Apologies if that's me. So that was one result, and that was quite pleasing, although I must admit it was quite resource intensive to tune the model. I was expecting results a little bit better than that. And the other result from this pilot study is that the hyperparameters that were optimal were those that reduced diversity and randomness in the response. Now, you might think that that is obvious, but I think that's important because those hyperparameters are probably very different at different ends of the scale than the ones that would be used in chat GPT, for example. So it suggests that maybe, certainly for this data set, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, is that using chat GPT just to check for console adherence or for reporting guideline adherence may not be the best route. Because 86% accuracy, this is, I'll dive more into the results, is fine, but because I must admit I was a little bit disappointed. I was expecting more of a headline result. And having spoke to Dr. Shah Neha, he convinced me that it was probably better and to move to the more advanced model. So the GPT-4, so more like the model that underpins the ChatGPT application. So that's what I did. I reran the analysis using a new version of GPT-4, which they call Turbo. One of the advantages in this is it has a much bigger context window. And that simply means you can feed it more text. So the GPT 3.5 has a context window of 4,096 tokens, which is roughly about 3,000 words, which means you can't really feed it a whole paper if you want to add stuff to it. And you certainly can feed it a whole paper and any supplementary material. GPT-4 with 128K context means that, although I didn't do it for this study, means in the future, I hopefully will be able to, instead of having to split the paper up, hopefully be able to just send a whole paper and ask it some questions. That was my thinking anyway. The other thing it can do is analyze images, and I'll present that data in a minute. Unfortunately, even though I requested it, I've not been given access to tune GPT-4. So the only tuning that I did, I confirmed the hyperparameters from the previous study, was I did some rudimentary prompt engineering. What that really means is I did some work on the way the question was asked. So in that table that's shown on there, those questions were iteratively altered to improve results in the training data set. There are many systematic ways in which you can do that. They require resources and platforms that I didn't think were necessary for this. So I did what somebody on a blog suggested, and I used ChatGPT to help me frame those questions. So ChatGPT has helped tune those questions, if you like, which is why perhaps they are quite verbose. And actually, that's trimmed. There's some other stuff that goes in front of it that it wanted as well. They perhaps aren't the way that a human would ask it, but this is what the machine wanted to produce the optimal results. When I ran the test data set through this model, accuracy was improved compared to GPT 3.5, but not by an earth-shattering amount, if I'm going to be honest. Accuracy, there's classification accuracy there, 90%. You can see there in the table, hopefully, didn't do badly on any one question, or I could have done better on some questions. It really struggles with the idea of a hypothesis, for example, I've noticed. And so, but I was reasonably happy with that result. These results hadn't been preprinted yet, but they're going to be added to the preprint over the next week. Or next week or two, probably. I also used GPT-4 to analyze images. This is really important when you're thinking about clinical trial reporting guidelines, because you might want to ask questions about, for example, the flow diagram or a figure. You couldn't do that with GPT 3.5. You can do it with GPT-4. It encodes images of base 64, so it treats it as text, and you can ask text-based questions to it. So for this analysis, I compared 10 completed consort flow diagrams from the data set that were identified as complete by the labels, the answers given by the Schultz analysis, and then 10 flow diagrams from the same data set where it was a flow diagram, but it lacked information about the reasons people might have been excluded after randomization or were lost to follow-up. So really, all of the flow diagrams should have answered question 1 correctly, but only half should have answered question 2 as yes, and the other half should have been no. I also included 10 non-consort flow diagrams, so Prisma flow diagrams or other flow diagrams, just to check it wasn't going to say everything was a consort flow diagram. It did pretty well on the first question, so I think it was okay at identifying whether the image was a consort flow diagram or not. It did misclassify one of the non-consort flow diagrams, but it did much more poorly at the second question. For the second question, I only compared the complete to the non-complete consort flow diagrams. It wasn't able to really decipher the information that was in that flow diagram. It only identified 4 of the non-complete ones as non-complete, and it should be 10 in both of those green boxes there. I didn't do a huge amount of tuning to this model because, in all honesty, it's extremely expensive. Like most of OpenAI stuff, it's extremely expensive to call, and this one in particular is extremely expensive. So this is almost like a base model response with no optimization whatsoever. It clearly does need some work. Okay, so those are the GPT studies. And the results from GPT-4, particularly for the text I'm talking about now, although pleasing, were not earth-shatteringly better than the fine-tuned model. And there's quite a few, I've seen quite a few opinion pieces where people have trained different models using the results from GPT to save money or whatever it is they want to do, and then used an open source large language model. I think open source is really important if you want to design a tool where you're checking clinical trials, for example, for adherence to reporting guidelines. And I can imagine an example where somebody is involved in drug discovery or something like that, and they want to publish the results of they want to check the results of their clinical trial for consort adherence, but they can't. That information is confidential. It might be sensitive. There might be many reasons they don't wish to send that information to a for-profit company, and particularly we're in Canada, a for-profit company whose servers are likely across an international border. And even though OpenAI stipulate they will not use the data that's sent to their API for training, I think anybody that's followed tech companies for the last 10 years knows that those terms and conditions can and likely will change in the future. And so I think open source, an open source large language model, open source AI is a very interesting field. So I was interested whether you could train an open source model and get it to perform checks for compliance to the research, the the reporting guidelines that we were looking at. There are many open source models, and I picked the one that was easiest to train on the platform I used. There's not been a systematic reason why I picked this. It's Meta's Llama 2 7B, the chat-tuned version. I should say that the data set that was used to train this model was very small. So for each reporting guideline item, there are only under 100 examples, which is a very small data set. And I did no other tuning to the model. I didn't try and tune any hyperparameters. I didn't try and tune the prompts. The prompts were those that came from ChatGPT, from OpenAI's GPT, sorry. Not presented here. These results are preliminary, so I don't even know when I'm going to preprint this, but I'm excited about them, so I'm showing them today. Not shown here is the improvement in performance when you fine-tune an open source model, or put another way, how poorly an open source model did on these questions before I tuned it, which was quite poor. The most exciting, well, the thing I'm excited about, I've yet to drum up the excitement in others I've talked to, but the most exciting thing for me is that the open source model actually, after some tuning, was pretty accurate. You could hopefully see the comparison between GPT-4 analysis and the open source analysis in that table. The only questions it did poorly on were the two questions about randomization. There were some questions I couldn't include because the context window is much smaller in the version of Llama 2 I used. So there was only 7 questions here. And the questions it did poorly on were those about randomization. And if you remember from the data I showed from Schultz, in this data set, randomization was particularly badly reported. And so my hunch is that in a better data set, a data set that's perhaps more represented in mainstream clinical trials, where these might be better reported, you might see an improvement there. And certainly once I have a bigger data set to train the model and I do more tuning, I would expect performance improvements there. Okay, so I've whipped through a load of results very quickly there. I'm going to summarize them now. Across all of the experiments, performance was adequate to good, I would say. Depending on, those are qualitative terms, and mileage may vary, I guess. Although for some aspects of it, particularly the image and other, particular questions, for example, a hypothesis question, the models would benefit from more tuning. Most exciting for me is that the fine-tuned open source, open access, I should say, but open access also, open source models show promise, and that's the aspect I'm probably most excited about. There are some severe limitations to my ability to draw conclusions. The first is that the model is checking whether something is reported. For example, did somebody define their primary outcome? And it can check the methods and decide that. But that doesn't mean that the primary outcome that's defined in the methods is actually the primary outcome. For example, the one the hypothesis is based around, or the one that the results are mostly tailored towards, or the statistical analysis was performed on. It just knows whether there was. Same for an effect size. You might report a standardized effect size and confidence intervals, but it might be the wrong standardized effect size and the confidence intervals are wrong. It's not checking for that, and other tools can. The most important thing, I think, and the thing that came from all of the tuning of the questions, is that the model is it's literal, and it's a novice. It knows nothing about what you're asking. It has no expertise, and even very, very slight changes to the language of the prompt can lead to really big downstream differences in the way that the model answers your question. And so I see this really as a tool by which you can complement expert review. I don't envisage a time in the near future where this task, checking a paper for compliance to a set of reporting guidelines, could be wholesale farmed out to an AI model. But it could, I think, with much more work, provide a system much like the plagiarism checker, whereby if anybody's used those, you get a report that says, oh, this section might be plagiarized. And then when you're familiar with the field or familiar with the way that academic writing happens, you can look at that section and think, oh, actually, that's okay, or they have referenced that properly, or that's not so bad. They probably just need to move the reference further down the paragraph to make it clear that that's where that's come from. And that's how I would view a tool built with this AI system. Probably the biggest limitation is that I haven't assessed how reliable the system is. Large language models, AI systems, are notorious for things like hallucinations, where they make things up or their answers are different. I think a reliability study, once I have a better model, and I'll talk a little bit about what that might do, will be important. I'd be interested to know actually whether we know the reliability of humans when they, for example, do we know how reliable a series of experts is when they are grading a set of papers for adherence to consort? I think that's important because it's fine to establish reliability for a machine, but it needs to be compared to the reliability of human reviewers, I think. And probably the biggest limitation and my biggest frustration comes from my ability to generalize the results here. I had to use one data set because that data set was open and I could use the labels. But there's a lack of other data sets that are currently available that I can test this model against, or test any models against. So that's going to be a problem moving forward. What do I want to do moving forward? The reporting guidelines that I used here, or the questions I asked, are not a one-to-one match with, for example, the consult reporting guidelines for clinical trials, randomized controlled trials. I want to build a model that asks the specific questions that you can find in the consult checklist, the various consult checklists. I have actually built a consult GPT, which is accessible to you if you have a ChatGPT Plus subscription. And perhaps when you use that, if you do use that, you might see some of the things that I've mentioned about the variability in the way that the ChatGPT responds to questions. I've often got a different answer from the same paper, same prompt, same question. So that needs a bit more tuning. I'm more interested in building a model, which the little video showing in the corner there. I've started work on this. I'm interested in building an app that would allow someone to upload a PDF, and then it would check that PDF for adherence to a series of reporting guidelines. So Consult or Prisma or the MI claim one, if it's an MI paper, and provide feedback to the user. So the model doesn't think you've met this item correctly for this reason. I'm building that now, but I need to do more work on the underlying model, and I'm particularly interested in a app that would use an open source model. And so that's going to be, I think, my focus moving forward. And yeah, and extend it to other reporting guidelines as well, not just consult. Okay, I've gone through a lot there, and I apologize for that. I get a bit excited. I want to show everybody everything, so I'm happy to answer any questions and things I might have skipped. I'd like to thank my collaborators at UBC, Claire, Corinne, Paul, and also the advice and patience I've received from Neha and Carnegie Mellon and David at University of Ottawa, who have been helped shape my thinking and many of the things I've done here. Thank you.